In the grand halls of Valdemara Palace, where centuries of tradition echo through marble corridors, a single photograph hidden in an ancient desk drawer holds the power to destroy a kingdom. When Crown Prince Alexander discovers this image on the eve of his coronation, he realizes that everything he believed about his family, his birthright, and his destiny has been built on lies. The woman he thought was his stepmother has been hiding a secret so explosive that it could not only cost him the throne but could unravel the very foundation of the monarchy itself. As palace bells ring to announce the dawn of his reign, Alexander must choose between protecting the crown he was born to wear and exposing a truth that will shatter the lives of everyone he loves. But, in a world where loyalty is currency and betrayal lurks behind every smile, some secrets refuse to stay buried, and the price of truth might be higher than the cost of lies. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Valdemara Palace as Crown Prince Alexander walked through the corridors that would soon witness his coronation. At 28, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of preparation for this moment. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his royal blue uniform pressed to perfection, and his expression held the careful neutrality that had been drilled into him since childhood. Yet beneath this composed exterior, his mind raced with the weight of responsibility that would soon rest upon his shoulders. The palace buzzed with activity as servants and officials scurried about, making final preparations for the ceremony that would transform him from crown prince to king. Flower arrangements arrived by the dozen, their sweet fragrance filling the air with promise. Crystal chandeliers were polished until they sparkled like stars, and every surface gleamed with meticulous care. The throne room, where generations of his ancestors had been crowned, waited in silent majesty for its newest sovereign. Alexander paused at a large window overlooking the palace gardens, where hundreds of staff members worked tirelessly to ensure everything would be perfect for the thousands of guests expected to attend. Foreign dignitaries, heads of state, and representatives from every corner of the kingdom would gather to witness this historic moment. The responsibility felt heavier with each passing hour, but he had been trained for this his entire life. His father, King Edmund, had ruled with wisdom and compassion for 35 years before his peaceful death 6 months ago. The transition period had been challenging, but Alexander had handled his duties with the same dedication that had earned him respect throughout the kingdom. He had spent years learning statecraft, diplomacy, and the delicate art of balancing tradition with the needs of a modern nation. The people trusted him, Parliament supported him, and the military stood ready to serve their new king. Queen Isabella, his stepmother, had been his anchor during these difficult months. She had married his father when Alexander was just 12 years old, following his mother's tragic death in a car accident. Over the years, Isabella had become more than just his father's wife. She had become a trusted advisor, a source of comfort, and the closest thing to a mother he had known since childhood. Her grace, intelligence, and unwavering support had helped shape him into the man he was today. The relationship between Alexander and Isabella had always been special. She had never tried to replace his beloved mother, Queen Catherine, but instead had honored her memory while creating new traditions and bringing her own warmth to the palace. She understood the burden of royal duty, having grown up in nobility herself, and her guidance had been invaluable as Alexander prepared for kingship. Her presence at state functions, her diplomatic skills, and her genuine care for the people had made her beloved throughout the kingdom. As Alexander made his way toward his private study, he reflected on the conversation he had shared with Isabella the previous evening. She had seemed unusually distant, her normally bright eyes clouded with something he couldn't quite identify. When he had asked if everything was well, she had simply smiled and assured him that coronation nerves affected everyone, even those who had been through royal ceremonies before. Her words had been comforting, but something in her manner had left him unsettled. The study had always been his sanctuary within the palace. It was here that he had spent countless hours with tutors, learning languages, history, and the complex art of governance. The room was lined with books from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings worn smooth by generations of royal hands. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the space, its surface covered with documents requiring his attention before the ceremony. As Alexander settled into the familiar leather chair behind the desk, he noticed that one of the drawers was slightly ajar. This was unusual, as the palace staff were meticulous about ensuring everything remained in perfect order, especially during such an important time. He pulled the drawer open fully, expecting to find the usual collection of documents and supplies, but instead discovered something that made his heart skip a beat. Hidden beneath a stack of old papers was a photograph he had never seen before. The image was slightly faded with age, but the faces were unmistakably clear. It showed a much younger Isabella, perhaps in her early 20s, standing beside a man Alexander didn't recognize. They were both smiling broadly, and the woman wore a simple white dress while the man was dressed in casual civilian clothes. What shocked Alexander most was not just Isabella's youthful appearance, but the obvious intimacy between the two figures in the photograph. The man had his arm wrapped protectively around Isabella's waist, and she leaned into him with the comfortable familiarity of someone deeply in love. But what truly stunned Alexander was the small detail he noticed in the corner of the image. Isabella's left hand rested on the man's chest, and, clearly visible on her finger, was a simple gold wedding band. This photograph had been taken years before she had ever met his father, yet she was clearly already married to someone else. Alexander's hands trembled as he examined the photograph more closely. On the back, written in Isabella's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "My beloved Marcus, our wedding day, forever yours." The date written below was from nearly 30 years ago, just 2 years before Isabella had supposedly first met King Edmund at a diplomatic function in Vienna. According to the official story that had been repeated countless times in biographies and newspaper articles, Isabella had been a young widow when she met the king, her first husband having died in a climbing accident in Switzerland. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. If Isabella had been married to this Marcus person, what had happened to him? Why had she lied about being a widow? More importantly, what other secrets might she be hiding? The woman who had helped raise him, who had stood by his side through every important moment of his adult life, had built their entire relationship on a fundamental deception. Alexander's mind raced through memories, searching for clues he might have missed. He remembered Isabella's occasional distant looks during family gatherings, the way she sometimes seemed lost in thought when she believed no one was watching. There had been moments when she received phone calls that she took in private, speaking in hushed tones that ceased whenever someone approached. At the time, he had assumed these were simply personal matters or perhaps sensitive political discussions, but now they took on a more sinister significance. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If Isabella had lied about her past, if she was potentially still married to another man when she wed his father, then her marriage to the king might have been invalid. This would mean that any influence she had wielded as queen, any decision she had participated in, any official acts she had performed, could all be called into question. The scandal would not only destroy her reputation but could potentially damage the monarchy itself. Alexander thought about the coronation ceremony just hours away. Thousands of people were gathering to witness his ascension to the throne, trusting in the stability and integrity of the royal institution. Foreign leaders had traveled across the globe to pay their respects to the new king. The ceremony had been planned for months, every detail carefully orchestrated to project strength and continuity. How could he possibly proceed with this knowledge burning in his mind? The photograph seemed to grow heavier in his hands as the full weight of the situation became clear. Isabella was scheduled to play a prominent role in the coronation ceremony, as was traditional for the Queen Mother. She would be seated in a place of honor, her presence lending legitimacy and continuity to the proceedings. The very sight of her would remind the assembled dignitaries of the royal family's stability and the smooth transition from his father's reign to his own. But now, every time Alexander looked at her, he would see not the woman who had helped guide him to this moment, but someone who had built her entire life on a lie. The trust that had formed the foundation of their relationship had been shattered in an instant, replaced by doubt and suspicion that threatened to consume him. He wondered what other secrets might be hidden within the palace walls, what other truths had been carefully concealed behind the facade of royal perfection. As Alexander sat alone in his study, the weight of crown and kingdom pressing down upon him, he realized that the coronation would mark not just the beginning of his reign, but also the start of a journey into a world where nothing was as it seemed. The photograph in his hands had opened a door that could never be closed again, and whatever lay beyond it would test not only his ability to rule, but his capacity to uncover the truth while protecting the institution he had sworn to serve. The morning light continued to stream through the tall windows, but, for Alexander, the day that was meant to mark his greatest triumph had suddenly become the beginning of his greatest challenge. The crown awaited, but so did the truth, and he was beginning to realize that the two might be impossible to reconcile. Alexander spent the next hour staring at the photograph, his mind cycling through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. The man in the picture, Marcus, had kind eyes and a genuine smile that suggested deep happiness. This was not a formal portrait or a casual friendship photo. This was clearly a wedding picture, capturing a moment of pure joy between two people who believed they were beginning their lives together. The question that haunted Alexander was simple yet devastating: where was this man now, and did Isabella's marriage to his father constitute bigamy? The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor jolted Alexander from his thoughts. He quickly slipped the photograph into his jacket pocket and tried to compose himself as his private secretary, James Morrison, knocked and entered the study. James had served the royal family for 15 years, his loyalty and discretion making him invaluable during both routine operations and times of crisis. His presence usually brought Alexander comfort, but today even James's familiar efficiency couldn't calm the storm raging in the prince's mind. "Your Royal Highness, the final rehearsal for the procession will begin in 30 minutes, James announced, his voice carrying its usual professional tone. "The Archbishop has requested a brief meeting beforehand to review the ceremonial responses, and Queen Isabella has asked to speak with you privately before the proceedings begin." The mention of Isabella's name sent a chill through Alexander's body. How could he face her now, knowing what he knew? How could he stand beside her during the most important day of his life, wondering if everything about their relationship had been built on deception? Yet he realized he had no choice. The coronation could not be delayed or cancelled without creating a crisis that would reverberate around the world. He had to proceed, at least for now, while he figured out how to handle this explosive revelation. "Of course," Alexander replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Please inform Queen Isabella that I'll meet with her in the blue drawing room in 20 minutes. And, James, I need you to do something for me with absolute discretion. I need you to research someone named Marcus, possibly connected to Queen Isabella's past. I need to know everything about him, but this must be handled with complete confidentiality." James raised an eyebrow but showed no other sign of surprise. His years of service had taught him that royal requests often came without explanation, and his job was to fulfill them without question. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Shall I prioritize this research, or can it wait until after the coronation?" "Priority," Alexander said firmly. "I need whatever information you can find as soon as possible, but please ensure that no one else becomes aware of this inquiry. Use only our most trusted contacts, and keep all communications off the record." As James left to carry out his instructions, Alexander remained seated at his desk, the weight of the photograph seeming to burn through his jacket pocket. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure, a skill that had served him well during diplomatic negotiations and public appearances. But this situation was unlike anything he had ever faced. This wasn't a political crisis or a public relations challenge, this was personal, involving the woman who had helped shape his character and worldview. 20 minutes later, Alexander made his way to the blue drawing room, one of the palace's most elegant spaces. The room was decorated in soft blue and gold tones, with portraits of previous monarchs gazing down from the walls. It was here that his father had often held informal meetings with family members, and where Alexander had shared many important conversations with Isabella over the years. The irony was not lost on him that this room, which held so many positive memories, was about to become the site of what might be the most difficult conversation of his life. Isabella was already waiting when he arrived, standing gracefully beside one of the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. She wore a deep navy dress that complemented her still youthful figure, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon that spoke of royal sophistication. At 53, she remained a strikingly beautiful woman, her face showing only the faintest lines that spoke of wisdom rather than age. Her posture was perfect, her expression serene, but Alexander noticed something different in her eyes, a tension that seemed to mirror his own internal turmoil. "Alexander," she said warmly, turning to embrace him as she had done countless times before. But today, her touch felt different to him, as if he were hugging a stranger rather than the woman he had considered a second mother. "I wanted to speak with you privately before the ceremony begins. There's something important I need to share with you." Alexander's heart began to race. Could she possibly know that he had discovered the photograph? Was she about to confess voluntarily? He struggled to maintain his composure as he gestured for her to sit in one of the comfortable armchairs arranged near the fireplace. "I've been thinking about your father a great deal these past few days," Isabella began, her voice soft but steady. "About the promises I made to him, about the responsibilities I accepted when I became your stepmother, and about the role I've played in preparing you for this moment. Edmund was so proud of the man you've become, Alexander. He often told me that his greatest accomplishment wasn't his own reign, but raising a son who would be an even better king than he was." Alexander felt a pang of guilt at her words. His father had indeed been proud of him, and that pride had been one of the driving forces in Alexander's dedication to his royal duties. To hear Isabella speak of his father's love and confidence made his current suspicions feel like a betrayal, even though he knew he wasn't the one who had lied. "There's something else," Isabella continued, her voice dropping slightly. "Something I should have told you years ago, but I believed it was better kept private. It concerns my life before I met your father, and I realize now that as you prepare to take the throne, you deserve to know the complete truth about the people around you." Alexander's pulse quickened. This was it, she was going to tell him about Marcus, about the marriage she had concealed. Part of him felt relief that she was choosing to be honest, but another part of him wondered what had prompted this sudden confession. Did she know he had found the photograph, or was this driven by her own conscience? "Before I met your father," Isabella said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, "I was married to another man. His name was Marcus Chen, and he was a doctor working with international relief organizations. We were young and very much in love, and we believed we would spend our entire lives together. But Marcus's work took him to dangerous places around the world, providing medical care in war zones and disaster areas." The mention of Marcus's surname sent another shock through Alexander's system. Chen suggested Asian heritage, which would explain some of the facial features he had noticed in the photograph but hadn't been able to place. It also raised new questions about Isabella's past and the complexity of the deception she had maintained. "What happened to him?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella's composure cracked slightly, and, for the first time in his memory, Alexander saw her struggle with genuine emotion. "Marcus disappeared while working in a conflict zone in Southeast Asia. His medical team was providing aid to refugees when their convoy was attacked. Several team members were killed, others were taken prisoner, and Marcus simply vanished. For months, I waited for news, hoping he would be found alive, but, eventually, the international organizations declared him dead in absentia." Alexander felt his worldview shifting once again. If Isabella's story was true, then she hadn't been lying about being a widow when she met his father. But why had she never spoken of this first marriage? Why had she allowed everyone to believe that his father was her first and only husband? "I never spoke of Marcus publicly because the circumstances of his death were so traumatic," Isabella continued. "The organizations involved requested privacy for security reasons, as there were still personnel working in the region who could have been endangered if too much attention was drawn to the incident. When I met your father 2 years later, I was honest with him about my past, but we agreed that for both personal and security reasons, it would be best not to make my first marriage part of the public record." Alexander studied Isabella's face carefully, looking for any signs of deception. Her story was plausible, even sympathetic, but something about it didn't feel complete. The photograph in his pocket seemed to contradict the image of a grieving widow that she was painting. The couple in that picture looked like they were at the beginning of their life together, not facing the kind of dangerous separation that Isabella was describing. "I'm telling you this now," Isabella said, reaching across to take his hand, "because I want you to begin your reign with complete honesty between us. Your father felt that the truth might create unnecessary complications, but I believe you're strong enough to handle the complexities of real life, not just the sanitized version that's usually presented to royalty." Alexander wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the relief that should come with an honest explanation. But the photograph burning in his pocket suggested that there was still more to the story. The handwriting on the back had been clear: "My beloved Marcus, our wedding day, forever yours." Those weren't the words of someone preparing for a dangerous separation, they were the words of someone beginning a new chapter in life with complete confidence and joy. I appreciate your honesty, Alexander said carefully, and I understand why you and father chose to keep this private. But, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain that Marcus is dead? Have you ever had any contact with him since he disappeared? Isabella's reaction was immediate and striking. Her face went pale, and she withdrew her hand from his as if he had struck her. For a moment, she seemed to struggle for words, and Alexander saw something in her eyes that looked very much like fear. Why would you ask such a question? She whispered. Of course I'm certain. The investigation was thorough, and I was officially notified of his death. Alexander, what's brought this on? You seem different today, almost suspicious. Has someone said something to you? Alexander realized he was at a crossroads. He could continue to probe, potentially forcing Isabella into more lies, or he could reveal what he had discovered and demand the complete truth. The coronation was now just hours away, and whatever decision he made would affect not only their relationship but potentially the stability of the monarchy itself. I found something this morning, he said quietly, reaching into his pocket. Something that raises questions about the story you've just told me. As he pulled out the photograph, Alexander watched Isabella's face transform from confusion to shock to something that looked remarkably like terror. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever truth lay beneath the surface, it was far more complicated than anything she had yet revealed. The photograph trembled in Alexander's hands as Isabella stared at it with the expression of someone seeing a ghost. The color drained from her face completely, and she seemed to shrink into her chair as if the weight of decades-old secrets was finally crushing down upon her. For several long moments, the only sound in the blue drawing room was the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece, marking time toward a coronation that now felt impossibly distant despite being just hours away. Where did you find this? Isabella's voice was barely audible, and her hands shook as she reached toward the photograph before pulling back as if it might burn her fingers. The confident, composed woman who had entered the room just minutes earlier had vanished, replaced by someone who looked fragile and frightened. In my study, hidden in a drawer that was never meant to be opened, Alexander replied, his own voice tight with the strain of maintaining control. Isabella, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Not the sanitized version you think I can handle, not the story you told my father, but the actual truth about who you are and what happened to the man in this photograph. Isabella stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to Alexander as she stared out at the gardens where final preparations for the coronation celebration were still underway. Workers were hanging banners and arranging flowers, creating a festival atmosphere that seemed to mock the crisis unfolding inside the palace. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of exhaustion that suggested she had been carrying this burden for far too long. His name is Marcus Chen, and he's not dead, she said quietly. He never was. I lied about his death because I couldn't bear to tell the truth about why I left him, and, over the years, the lie became so embedded in my life that changing it seemed impossible. Alexander felt the floor shift beneath his feet. You mean he's alive? You're still married to him? Legally, yes, Isabella whispered. Though we haven't spoken in over 25 years, and he has no idea where I am or what became of me after I disappeared from his life. The implications hit Alexander like a series of physical blows. If Isabella was still legally married to Marcus Chen, then her marriage to his father had been bigamous, making her not a queen but an impostor who had held one of the most respected positions in the kingdom under false pretenses. Every official act she had performed, every ceremony she had attended, every decision she had influenced, all of it had been built on a foundation of fraud. You need to explain this to me from the beginning, Alexander said, his voice harder now as the reality of the situation became clear. And, I mean everything, Isabella. The coronation is in 3 hours, and I need to know exactly what kind of scandal I'm inheriting along with the crown. Isabella turned back to face him, and Alexander was shocked to see tears streaming down her cheeks. In all the years he had known her, through his father's illness and death, through countless state functions and family crises, he had never seen her cry. The sight of her tears made him realize just how devastating this revelation was, not just for him, but for her as well. Marcus and I were married when I was 22, she began, sinking back into her chair with the defeat of someone finally surrendering to the inevitable. He was brilliant, compassionate, and dedicated to helping people in the world's most dangerous places. We had 2 wonderful years together, but I was young and naive about what it meant to be married to someone whose calling required him to risk his life regularly. Alexander listened intently, trying to reconcile this story with the woman he had known for over 15 years. The Isabella he knew was sophisticated, worldly, and completely comfortable with the demands of public life. It was difficult to imagine her as a young woman struggling with the uncertainties of her husband's dangerous career. When Marcus took a position with a medical relief organization that would require him to spend months at a time in war zones and disaster areas, I panicked, Isabella continued. I was terrified that I would lose him, either to violence or to his devotion to his work. We had terrible arguments about it. He believed it was his moral obligation to help those who needed it most, and I believed his first obligation should be to our marriage. So you left him? Alexander asked, though he could hardly believe that the woman who had shown such strength and loyalty to his family would abandon her own husband. I left him, Isabella confirmed, her voice filled with shame. While he was away on a mission, I packed everything I could carry and disappeared. I used money from our joint account to buy a new identity, changed my name, and started a new life in Vienna. I told myself that if he truly loved me, he would come after me, but I made sure he couldn't find me. I wanted him to choose me over his work, but I didn't give him the chance to make that choice. Alexander struggled to process this information. The woman who had taught him about honor, duty, and loyalty had built her entire life on the ultimate betrayal. She had abandoned her husband without explanation and, then, constructed an elaborate lie to cover her tracks. How did you meet my father? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I met Edmund at a diplomatic reception in Vienna, exactly as the official story states, Isabella said. But I wasn't a widow mourning a lost husband. I was a runaway wife hiding from the life I had abandoned. Edmund was kind, stable, and offered me the security that Marcus's lifestyle never could. When he proposed, I convinced myself that my marriage to Marcus was effectively over anyway, that he had probably moved on and forgotten about me. But you never divorced Marcus, Alexander said. You never legally ended your first marriage before entering into a second one. I couldn't, Isabella admitted. Getting a divorce would have required revealing my location and identity to Marcus, and I was terrified of facing him after what I had done. I told myself that since he believed I was dead, which I learned he did after I read about his unsuccessful search for me, the legal technicality didn't matter. But, of course, it mattered enormously. Alexander stood and began pacing the room, his mind racing through the potential consequences of this revelation. If the truth became public, it wouldn't just destroy Isabella's reputation, it would call into question the legitimacy of his father's second marriage and potentially create a constitutional crisis. The monarchy depended on public trust and the perception of moral authority, both of which would be severely damaged by the revelation that a queen had been living a lie for over 2 decades. Does anyone else know about this? He asked. Anyone at all? No one, Isabella replied. I've carried this secret alone for 25 years. There have been moments when I wanted to confess to your father, especially during his final illness, but I couldn't bear to destroy his peace during his last days. I told myself I would take the secret to my grave, but seeing you prepare for your coronation made me realize how unfair it was to burden you with the consequences of my deception without at least giving you the knowledge to protect yourself. Alexander stopped pacing and fixed Isabella with a stern look. What consequences, specifically? Is there any chance that Marcus could surface and expose this? Is he a threat to the monarchy? Isabella shook her head, but her expression remained troubled. Marcus became a highly respected physician and humanitarian. He eventually remarried and had children, believing himself to be a widower. As far as I know, he has no idea that I'm alive, let alone that I became a queen. But what? Alexander demanded. He's been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for his humanitarian work, Isabella said quietly. The announcement was made last week, and if he wins, there will be extensive media coverage of his life story, including his first marriage to a mysterious woman who supposedly died tragically. If any enterprising journalist decides to investigate that part of his biography too deeply. Alexander felt his blood run cold. The Nobel Peace Prize was one of the world's most prestigious awards, and winners invariably became the subject of intense media scrutiny. If Marcus Chen won the prize and journalists began investigating his past, it was entirely possible that someone might discover inconsistencies in the story of his first wife's death. In today's digital age, with advanced search capabilities and global databases, even carefully constructed lies from decades past could be exposed. "When will the Nobel Prize winner be announced?" Alexander asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Next month," Isabella replied. October 15th. Alexander realized that they might have as little as 3 weeks before this secret exploded into public view. The coronation, which was supposed to mark the beginning of a new era of stability for the monarchy, might instead be the prelude to the greatest scandal in royal history. Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. James Morrison entered with a discreet cough, carrying a folder that Alexander immediately recognized as containing the research he had requested. "Your Royal Highness, I have the preliminary information you requested," James said, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious tension in the room. "Shall I return later, or would you prefer to review this material now?" Alexander looked at Isabella, who had composed herself somewhat but still appeared shaken. "Please, James. And please ensure that this conversation remains completely confidential." James nodded and opened the folder. Dr. Marcus Chen, age 55, currently serves as Director of International Medical Relief for the Global Health Initiative. He's widely respected in humanitarian circles and has been nominated for this year's Nobel Peace Prize for his work in refugee camps and disaster zones. He was married to a woman named Isabella Morrison in 1994, who was reported to have died in a climbing accident in Switzerland in 1996. He remarried in 2003 to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and they have 2 children together. Alexander noticed that Isabella flinched at the mention of Marcus's new family, and he wondered if she felt any guilt about the life he had rebuilt after believing her dead. "There's more," James continued. "Dr. Chen has never spoken publicly about his first wife, but, according to my sources, he still wears his original wedding ring on a chain around his neck. He's described by colleagues as being deeply affected by his first wife's death, and he apparently still visits her supposed grave in Switzerland every year on the anniversary of her reported death." The room fell silent as the full impact of this information settled over them. Marcus Chen wasn't just alive and unaware of Isabella's deception, he was still mourning her, still honoring a marriage that she had abandoned without explanation. The man had built a shrine to a lie, and his continued devotion made Isabella's betrayal seem even more cruel. Alexander realized that they were facing a crisis that went far beyond questions of legal technicalities or potential scandal. At the heart of this situation was a man who had spent 25 years believing that the woman he loved was dead, while she had been living a life of luxury and privilege that was built on the foundation of his grief. The moral implications were staggering, and Alexander had to decide how to handle them while protecting the institution he was about to swear to defend. The weight of Marcus Chen's continued devotion hung heavy in the air of the blue drawing room as Alexander struggled to comprehend the full scope of the moral catastrophe that had just been unveiled. The image of a grieving widower visiting an empty grave for 25 years, wearing his wedding ring as a memorial to a love that had been callously discarded, created a picture so devastating that it seemed to transcend the realm of political scandal and enter something far more profoundly wrong. Isabella sat motionless in her chair, her face a mask of anguish as James's words about Marcus's annual pilgrimages sank in. Alexander watched her carefully, noting how her hands trembled and how her breathing had become shallow and rapid. For the first time since discovering the photograph, he felt a flicker of sympathy for her, recognizing that whatever choices had led to this moment, she was now facing the consequences of decisions made by a much younger version of herself. "James," Alexander said quietly, "I need you to arrange for complete privacy for the next hour. No interruptions, no visitors, and no communications unless there's an absolute emergency. Can you also discreetly delay the final rehearsal by 30 minutes and inform the Archbishop that I'll meet with him afterward?" James nodded and withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. Alexander knew that delaying any part of the coronation schedule was risky, but he needed time to think clearly about how to proceed. The ceremony would begin in less than 2 hours, and whatever decision he made in this room would affect not only his own future but the stability of the institution he was about to inherit. Isabella, he said, his voice gentler now than it had been since the revelation began, I need you to help me understand something. When you made the decision to leave Marcus, when you chose to let him believe you were dead, did you truly think through what that would mean for him? Did you consider the possibility that he would spend decades mourning you? Isabella looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, and, for the first time since he had known her, she appeared completely vulnerable. I was 24 years old, Alexander. I was terrified, selfish, and convinced that the whole world revolved around my own fears and needs. I told myself that Marcus would grieve for a while and then move on, find someone better suited to his lifestyle, and eventually be happier without me. I never imagined that he would carry the loss for so many years. But you must have thought about him over the years, Alexander pressed. Especially after you married my father and understood what true commitment looked like. Didn't you ever consider trying to contact him, to let him know you were alive? Every day, Isabella admitted, her voice breaking. Especially after I learned to love your father the way I should have loved Marcus from the beginning. Edmund taught me what it meant to support someone's calling rather than resent it, to find strength in partnership rather than security in control. I realized that if I had been more mature, more selfless, I could have been the wife Marcus deserved. But, by then, so many years had passed, and I had built an entire life on the foundation of my lie. Alexander walked to the window and stared out at the coronation preparations, trying to process the emotional complexity of the situation alongside its practical implications. The moral dimension was clear: a terrible wrong had been done to an innocent man, and that wrong was continuing every day that Marcus Chin visited an empty grave and honored a memory built on deception. But the political dimension was equally complex, involving not just Isabella's personal redemption but the stability of the monarchy itself. There's something else we need to consider, Alexander said, turning back to face Isabella. The legal implications of what you've done extend beyond just the question of bigamy. As queen, you've been involved in state functions, official ceremonies, and government business. If your marriage to my father was invalid, then your position as queen was fraudulent, and that could call into question any official acts you performed. Isabella paled further at this suggestion. I never participated in any official government decisions. Your father was very careful to ensure that I only had ceremonial roles. That may not matter, Alexander replied grimly. Perception often matters more than reality in these situations. If the press discovers that a queen has been living a lie for decades, they won't be interested in the technical details of your involvement in government. They'll focus on the dramatic narrative of deception and betrayal, and the damage to the monarchy's reputation could be severe. The conversation was interrupted by another soft knock at the door. James entered with obvious reluctance, his expression suggesting that he bore news that couldn't wait despite Alexander's instructions for privacy. Your Royal Highness, I apologize for the interruption, but there's been a development, James said carefully. I've received word from our media monitoring service that a journalist from the International Tribune has been making inquiries about Dr. Marcus Chen's background in preparation for a feature story about Nobel Peace Prize nominees. The journalist has specifically asked questions about Dr. Chen's first marriage and his wife's death. Alexander felt his stomach drop. The crisis was accelerating beyond their control, and they might have days rather than weeks before the truth emerged. What kind of questions, specifically? The journalist apparently has sources in Switzerland who have raised questions about the climbing accident that supposedly killed Isabella Morrison Chen, James replied, carefully avoiding looking at Isabella as he spoke. There are inconsistencies in the official reports, and the gravesite has no actual burial records. The journalist seems to suspect that the death was fabricated. Isabella let out a small gasp and covered her face with her hands. Alexander realized that their window for controlling this situation was rapidly closing. If an investigative journalist was already on the trail of the truth, it was only a matter of time before the full story emerged. The question was no longer whether the scandal would break, but when, and whether they could find a way to minimize the damage. James, I need you to find out everything you can about this journalist and their investigation, Alexander said. Who they've spoken to, what evidence they've gathered, and how close they are to publishing. Use whatever resources are necessary, but maintain complete discretion. After James left, Alexander and Isabella sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about the rapidly deteriorating situation. Alexander found himself thinking not just about the immediate crisis, but about the broader questions of leadership and responsibility that would define his reign. How could he lead a nation with moral authority while harboring such a massive deception? How could he ask his people to trust the monarchy when its recent history was built on lies? Alexander, Isabella said quietly, I want you to know that whatever you decide to do about this situation, I'll support completely. If you feel that the only way to protect the monarchy is to expose the truth and let me face the consequences, I'll understand. I've known for years that this day might come, and I've tried to prepare myself for it. Alexander looked at her with new eyes, seeing not just the woman who had helped raise him, but someone who had been carrying an enormous burden of guilt and fear for decades. Despite her terrible choices, despite the consequences of her deception, he could see that she was genuinely remorseful and willing to accept responsibility for what she had done. There might be another way, he said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. What if we could find a way to make this right without destroying the monarchy in the process? What if we could somehow contact Marcus Chen and give him the closure he deserves while finding a path forward that protects the institution? Isabella looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. How could that possibly work? The moment Marcus learns the truth, the secret is out. Even if he agreed to keep it private, which seems unlikely given what I put him through, we'd still be at the mercy of anyone else who might discover the connection. Alexander began pacing again, his mind working through the possibilities. What if we could arrange for Marcus to learn the truth gradually, in a controlled way? What if we could present him with a story that gives him the closure he needs while protecting the information that would be most damaging to the monarchy? You mean lie to him again? Isabella asked, her voice reflecting both hope and horror at the suggestion. Not lie exactly, but perhaps manage the truth, Alexander said, though he felt uncomfortable with the phrase even as he spoke it. We could arrange for him to discover that you survived the accident but suffered amnesia and have been living under a different identity. We could say that you only recently recovered your memory and wanted to reconnect with him, but that you've built a new life and can't return to the old one. Isabella considered this proposition carefully. It would give him closure about my survival, but it wouldn't address the fundamental wrong I did to him. He would still have been deceived for 25 years, even if unintentionally according to this new story. But it might be a way to give him some peace while protecting the monarchy, Alexander argued. It's not perfect, but it might be the best solution available given the circumstances. Their discussion was interrupted by yet another knock at the door. This time, James entered with an expression of barely controlled panic that immediately told Alexander that the situation had taken another dramatic turn. Your Royal Highness, James said, his voice tight with tension, Dr. Marcus Chen is here. He's at the palace gates, asking to speak with Queen Isabella. The room fell completely silent. Isabella looked as if she might faint, while Alexander felt his carefully constructed plans crumbling around him. Somehow, impossibly, the man at the center of this crisis had arrived at the palace on the very day of the coronation, bringing with him the power to destroy everything they had worked to build and protect. How is that possible? Alexander asked, though he dreaded the answer. According to the security detail, he presented himself at the main gate 20 minutes ago with identification and a letter addressed to Queen Isabella, James replied. He says he's been investigating his first wife's death and has evidence that she survived the climbing accident. He claims to have proof that Isabella Morrison Chan and Queen Isabella are the same person. Alexander realized that their time for planning and preparation had run out. In less than an hour, he would either have to face Marcus Chen and deal with the consequences of a 25-year-old lie, or try to have him removed from the palace and risk creating an even bigger scandal. Either choice would fundamentally alter the course of his reign before it had even officially begun. The silence in the blue drawing room stretched on as Alexander and Isabella stared at James, both struggling to comprehend how their carefully guarded secret had suddenly walked up to the palace gates and demanded entry. The timing seemed impossible, almost as if the universe had conspired to create the most dramatic confrontation possible on the most important day of Alexander's life. What kind of evidence does he claim to have? Alexander asked, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. He wouldn't provide details to the security staff, but he mentioned having documents and photographs that prove Queen Isabella's true identity, James replied. He's been very polite but extremely persistent. He says he's been searching for the truth about his wife's disappearance for years, and recent publicity about the Nobel Prize nomination prompted him to make one final investigation. Isabella stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. I can't face him, Alexander. I can't look him in the eyes and see what 25 years of unnecessary grief has done to him. The man I knew was gentle and trusting, and I destroyed that innocence. What I see in his face now will haunt me for the rest of my life. Alexander watched Isabella's breakdown with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Part of him understood her emotional turmoil, but another part of him recognized that this crisis was far bigger than her personal feelings. The monarchy itself was at stake, and they needed to handle this situation with the utmost care and intelligence. James, Alexander said, I need you to arrange for Dr. Chen to wait in the green reception room. Provide him with refreshments and ensure he's treated with appropriate respect, but don't allow him to speak with anyone else. Tell him that someone will meet with him shortly to discuss his concerns. Should I inform the Archbishop about the potential delay to the coronation? James asked carefully. Alexander looked at the clock on the mantelpiece and realized that the coronation ceremony was now less than an hour away. Hundreds of dignitaries were already taking their seats in Westminster Abbey, millions of people around the world were preparing to watch the historic event, and the entire machinery of state was focused on this moment. The idea of delaying or canceling the coronation was almost unthinkable, but so was proceeding with such a massive scandal threatening to explode at any moment. Not yet, Alexander decided. Give me 15 minutes to think this through, then I'll make a final decision about how to proceed. After James left, Alexander turned to Isabella, who was now sitting with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Despite everything she had done, despite the magnitude of her deception, Alexander felt a wave of compassion for her. She had made terrible choices as a young woman, but she had spent years trying to be a good stepmother and queen, and he couldn't bring himself to see her as a villain. Isabella, I need you to listen to me carefully, he said, sitting down beside her and speaking in the gentle tone he might use with a frightened child. I know this is the most difficult moment of your life, but I need you to help me figure out the best path forward. Dr. Chen is here, and we can't make him disappear. We have to deal with this situation directly. Isabella looked up at him with tears streaming down her cheeks. What if I just confess everything to him? Tell him the truth about why I left, apologize for the pain I caused, and let him decide what to do with the information. At least then, I would have finally done the right thing, even if it destroys everything else. Alexander considered this option seriously. There was something appealing about the simple honesty of a complete confession, and it would certainly be the morally correct course of action. But he also had to consider the broader consequences, not just for Isabella and Marcus Chen, but for the monarchy and the nation. If you confess everything to Dr. Chen, what do you think he'll do with that information? Alexander asked. I don't know, Isabella admitted. The Marcus I knew was kind and forgiving, but that was before I put him through 25 years of unnecessary grief. He might be angry enough to expose everything publicly, or he might be compassionate enough to keep the secret to protect innocent people. I honestly can't predict how he'll react. Alexander stood and walked to the window once more, looking out at the crowds that were beginning to gather along the coronation route. These people had come to witness what they believed would be a moment of national celebration and renewal. They trusted in the institution of the monarchy and the integrity of the royal family. If the truth about Isabella's deception became public, that trust would be severely damaged, potentially for generations. But, as he watched the crowds, Alexander also thought about the man waiting in the green reception room, a man who had spent decades honoring a lie, visiting an empty grave, and carrying the weight of a loss that had been artificially created. Marcus Chen deserved the truth, but he also deserved to receive it in a way that caused him the least additional pain possible. A new idea began to form in Alexander's mind, one that was more complex than his earlier suggestions but might offer a path forward that served everyone's interests. It would require careful execution and a certain amount of deception, but it might be the only way to resolve the crisis without destroying lives in the process. Isabella, he said, turning back to face her, what if we could give Dr. Chen the closure he needs while also protecting the monarchy and giving you a chance to make amends for what you did? How could that possibly work? She asked. What if you were to meet with Dr. Chen privately and tell him a version of the truth that explains your disappearance without revealing your current identity? Alexander said, his plan becoming clearer as he spoke. You could tell him that you did survive the climbing accident but suffered severe injuries and amnesia. You could say that you only recently regained your memory and began searching for information about your past life. Isabella looked skeptical. But wouldn't he recognize me? Even after all these years, surely there would be some resemblance to the woman he married. Not necessarily, Alexander replied. You've aged 25 years, you've had access to the best stylists and cosmetic procedures, and you carry yourself differently now than you did as a young woman. If you altered your appearance slightly and met him in a context where he wasn't expecting to see you, he might not make the connection immediately. The plan Alexander was proposing was risky and morally ambiguous, but it offered several advantages. It would give Marcus Chen the closure he needed to know that his wife had survived. It would provide a plausible explanation for her disappearance that didn't involve deliberate abandonment, and it would allow Isabella to apologize for the pain she had caused without revealing her current identity and position. Even if the plan worked, Isabella said, I would still be living with the knowledge that I had deceived him again. How is that different from the original lie? Because this deception would be in service of healing rather than selfishness, Alexander replied. The original lie was about protecting yourself from the consequences of your choices. This would be about protecting him from unnecessary additional pain while giving him the peace he deserves. Isabella considered this argument carefully. Alexander could see that she was torn between her desire to make full amends for her past actions and her fear of the consequences that complete honesty might bring. Before she could respond, there was another knock at the door. James entered with an expression of urgency that suggested yet another complication had arisen. Your Royal Highness, I have an update from the security team monitoring Dr. Chen, James said. He's become increasingly agitated during his wait, and he's now threatening to go to the media if he doesn't receive answers soon. He says he has evidence that will expose a major royal scandal, and he's prepared to release it publicly if necessary. Alexander felt the last of his options slipping away. Marcus Chen wasn't just a grieving widower seeking closure, he was a man on a mission who was prepared to use whatever leverage he had to get the answers he sought. The gentle, trusting person Isabella remembered had been replaced by someone who had been hardened by years of unanswered questions and might not be willing to accept partial truths or elaborate explanations. How much time do we have before he follows through on his threat? Alexander asked. He's given us 30 minutes, James replied. After that, he says he's leaving the palace and going directly to the International Tribune with his story. Alexander looked at the clock and realized that 30 minutes would bring them almost exactly to the moment when the coronation ceremony was scheduled to begin. If Marcus Chen went public with his accusations at that precise moment, the scandal would overshadow the coronation completely and create a crisis that would dominate headlines around the world. I have to meet with him, Isabella said suddenly, her voice filled with a resolve that Alexander hadn't heard since the crisis began. Not with some elaborate deception or partial truth, but with complete honesty. I owe him that much, and I owe it to myself to finally do the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Alexander felt a mixture of admiration and terror at Isabella's decision. Her willingness to face the truth and accept responsibility was admirable, but the consequences could be devastating for everyone involved. If you meet with him and tell him everything, there's no controlling what happens next, Alexander warned. He could expose the entire story publicly, and the scandal could destroy not just your reputation but the monarchy itself. Then, that's a risk I'll have to take, Isabella replied, standing and smoothing her dress with the dignity that had made her such an effective queen. I've spent 25 years trying to avoid the consequences of my actions, and look where it's gotten us. Maybe it's time to have faith that honesty, even painful honesty, is ultimately better than the most carefully constructed lie. Alexander realized that he was facing one of the most important decisions of his life. He could try to prevent Isabella from meeting with Marcus Chan, perhaps having him removed from the palace by security, but that would only delay the inevitable and might make the eventual scandal even worse. Or he could allow Isabella to confess everything and hope that somehow, despite the enormous risks involved, the truth would prove to be less destructive than continued deception. As he looked at Isabella, Alexander saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before, a kind of peaceful determination that suggested she had finally accepted what she needed to do. For the first time since discovering the photograph that morning, he felt that they might be moving toward a resolution that, while painful, was ultimately right. "If you're determined to do this," Alexander said quietly, "then I'll support you. But I want to be there when you meet with him. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Isabella smiled at him through her tears, and, for a moment, Alexander saw a glimpse of the woman who had helped raise him and guide him toward this moment. Whatever her past mistakes, whatever deception she had maintained, she was still the person who had taught him about courage, dignity, and the importance of doing what was right even when it was difficult. 25 minutes later, as the coronation ceremony was meant to be beginning, Alexander and Isabella walked together toward the green reception room, where a man waited to hear the truth that would change everything. Behind them, the sounds of celebration could be heard as crowds gathered to witness what they believed would be a moment of joy and renewal. But, inside the palace, three people were about to have a conversation that would determine not just their own futures, but the future of an institution that had endured for centuries. As they approached the door, Alexander realized that this was the real test of his fitness to rule. Not the ceremonial moment when a crown would be placed on his head, but this moment when he would discover whether he had the wisdom and courage to navigate a crisis that threatened everything he held dear. The crown could wait, the truth could not.